Who are you? Where are you? And how do you make a living on the edge?
Hello, I'm Steve Lawson and I'm in Birmingham, and I'm ostensibly a musician, but my career is more a kind of portfolio thing. I get paid to be curious about things. The musician bit is integral to it all. It's kind of the centre of the wheel. I started out with a fairly conventional career in music after leaving college in the 90s, playing music with other people, doing bits of TV and radio and theatre and stuff. And then at the end of the 90s, had the opportunity to play a solo show, which I did, and I recorded and put on my website, as was then, and people liked it and said, "This is great, when's the album coming out?" And at the time I was also a journalist. I was writing for various music magazines, and so I knew that there was pretty much no money in making solo records as a bass playing instrumentalist. I knew that the people who did it as a loss leader, and I thought that it had to be better than that. I knew that it only cost a couple of quid to do CDs with really nice packaging, and that at the time people were quite happy to pay £10 for a CD. So I thought, hold on a minute, someone somewhere is siphoning off loads of money, because I could make this record for nothing. Then I recorded it via mini disc in front of my amp, and that became my first album. I got a friend who had a Pro Tools set up to mix it, and I put it out, and it sold, and it broke even very quickly and started to make money. And so I did it completely outside of the functioning recording industry as was. I just had a hunch that that way of doing things was probably going to disappear. It wasn't that I'd done some great analysis of the world and saw emerging technologies. It was just that the conversation I was having with my audience at the time was sufficient to lead me to believe that actually there was a way of making it sustainable outside of that. And so sustainability became the key. That was kind of the beautiful thing of doing it that way, was that I didn't have someone else trying to tell me what success looked like and trying to make me accept them spending money on my behalf in order to make me successful, while constantly telling me that whatever level I'd got to was still on the way there, and that somewhere along the line I would actually be properly successful, which is the crap that gets served up to pretty much every musician who's ever been signed. So the same happened with gigs. I started to get booked for gigs based on people finding what I did interesting and getting in touch with me. I booked a lot of my own gigs. I knew that there were people in a certain area because I was talking to them online, and so I thought, great, well, I'll go and do a show there, and at least 10 or 15 people will show up. And actually 10 or 15 people paying £10 each is 150 quid, which is what I get paid to play bass with someone at the Shepherd's Bush Empire if I was playing bass in a band. So suddenly the economics of it was such that I didn't feel that my validation came through someone else making loads of money, which is basically the model of the record industry. Was the idea that people would tell you that them making loads of money was what was important, rather than you being able to live. And it's kind of weird. It always struck me as odd, and I think I was lucky that I got into playing my own music in my very late 20s rather than when I was in my teenage years, because I might have succumbed to that particular brand of bullshit if I'd got into that at that time. So I had this emerging portfolio career. As I said, I was already writing for a music magazine, and through that I was meeting up with the kind of people who I wanted to work with and get feedback from, and who were useful to write about me as well. So I had this fantastic network of people that I'd met through being a journalist. I was teaching, so I had a profile as a teacher and as a writer about music education. And it became apparent pretty quickly that my aim was not to end up being a quote-unquote full-time musician. I didn't want to spend 12 hours a day with a bass in my hands. That sounded to me like a terrible failure of expectation. Kind of there was this real a dearth of imagination in thinking that was what we wanted to do, because life was so interesting, and I loved teaching, and I loved writing, and I liked doing all the other stuff. And so, and it also was much more stable. At the time, sort of late 90s into the turn of the century, there were a couple of bits of the tech industry in particular that collapsed quite spectacularly. That after the turn of the millennium, obviously the Y2K thing, which had been a massive cash cow for techies, suddenly vanished, and a lot of people were left out of work. And because I was able to switch between teaching, writing and playing, I only ever needed one of them to be paying the bills at any one time. And so it meant that I wasn't looking to play music that I didn't like. I kept on playing music that I loved. It meant that I could write as often as I needed to when I needed to, and that in between I was teaching, and that all the experience that I got from the other things became part of that teaching thing. So I had developed this portfolio career, which was both more stable at the time and more interesting than being stuck with a single job. But it went. Oh, sorry, you're going to ask a question?
Well, I was going to ask a question, but you can carry on if you want.
Well, send me a question and I'll ignore it.
I was just going to ask about the whole thing of the recording industry and their constant attacks and constant claims that struggling artists and creatives and musicians are losing money due to piracy, due to the Pirate Bay, due to etc., etc., etc. Much as older people like you and me heard this stuff before about cassettes. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I kind of didn't take it seriously. I mean, the whole the first time round when they started complaining about Napster, I was slightly concerned by Napster when I first started. That as a musician who at the time was making money off CDs, I didn't give it much thought. But this idea that this future version of the world where everybody could download everything for free initially concerned me. I kind of thought, oh, that doesn't sound so great. And I didn't. When BitTorrent emerged, I wasn't using torrent client for editing at all for quite a long time because, again, it just seemed like a kind of slightly troubling frontier. But the more that the record industry went on about it, the more it became apparent that this was probably going to be a good thing because they hated it. But given their history of not supporting artists at all, that it's never. I mean, this was the kind of the annoying part of their particular narrative. Was this idea that they were harking back to a non-existent ideal of them being the ones who were paying artists to make records and keeping this flourishing creative scene alive, and it was crap. I mean, they were monopolistic, they were abusive, they were intentionally plying artists with drugs, at least partly because that stops them from asking questions. They were obfuscating people's accounts. I mean, it was just it was a protection racket more than anything. It's a horrible business for people to be a part of. And I'd seen that in the 90s. I'd seen it firsthand. I'd looked at people and I'd met people who were massively successful, but constantly being told that they weren't successful enough, and that's why they hadn't broken even. Terrible, terrible way to do things. And so the fact that they were kind of going, oh, this is terrible, this is destroying our business model. I thought, oh, okay, well, if it's destroying their business model, there might be something in it. And what I was finding was that as these technologies were coming along, people who were finding me, because I was very visible online, the people who were finding my music through other people were coming back to me and saying hi. I remember a story of a guy buying one of my CDs in a second-hand record shop in San Jose, and then looking up the address on the back and coming and saying, oh, hello, I just bought one of your albums in a shop in San Jose. And I thought, well, blimey, I didn't know any shops there that were stocking them. And he said, no, it's a second-hand shop. And instead of going, that's terrible, I haven't been paid for that, I was kind of excited that suddenly this guy had seen the CD and thought it was exciting enough to buy. So, yeah, so I think that the artists versus the RIAA and the BPI thing became, I mean, I kind of didn't take it seriously for a long time. They were, when it was Lars Ulrich stood outside his mansion shouting about how people on Napster were stealing his livelihood. I mean, it was so farcical. It was almost impossible to satirise. It's like, sorry, I'm a millionaire, a multi-millionaire. I've just, and I can only afford 8 Rolls Royces now instead of 9. And you've stolen all my Rolls Royces. It was so stupid. And then I discovered that actually inviting people to download my stuff and pay what they wanted for it, which was this kind of emerging notion that actually there was a kind of a different kind of economics around music, and that was at least partly worked because it was distinct from the brazenly crass economics of the record industry, and the fact that all the online stores that were selling MP3s were selling them as though they were CDs on the internet. So this idea that things had a unit cost that was related to the physical dimensions of a CD, $7.99 for an album on iTunes. Well, why? What's that based on? It doesn't make any sense. So the emerging possibilities of making music available and saying, you know what, I think you should have a listen to this. It's my life is better if you're listening to it than it is if you're not listening to it. And once you've had a listen to it, and you know a bit about me, and you kind of, if you want to be a part of this, you can pay what you think it's worth. And what you think it's worth isn't necessarily, if you want to stick a unit cost on 60 minutes of music, then that's fine, you can do that. But if you think that you want to be a patron of what I'm up to, you can do that as well. And if you're broke, then please don't. I don't want you to go into debt to buy my music. Just have it and enjoy it. And that conversation was so obviously counter to the wisdom of the industry that those of us who were, I think I was probably fairly early in on that one. Those of us who started doing that, that became a kind of a meta narrative of what we were doing in and of itself. So there was the story of the music, and then there's the story about the access to the music. That it became another strand in our and in that sense, it functioned in the way that marketing used to. But it was multi-threaded because we could talk about music, we could talk about access to music, we could talk about our own sense of gratitude to our audience for bothering to come and listen. Because again, the old model fostered this kind of adversarial position between artist and audience, where the idea that someone wanted to listen to you was a bad thing unless they came up with money, which is insane. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just that given that we're creative people who thrive on the connection that our creative endeavours make between us and the people who like what we do, the idea that somehow someone wanting to listen to it and being annoyed at the machinations of the industry, and therefore circumventing them, but that somehow made them bad, that was a ludicrous idea. That was a nonsense notion. So suddenly having the option to get around that, but that all kind of happened off the back of the way that social media enabled us to start talking to the people who listened to what we were doing. Because I was using my website as a social media forum before the term social media was certainly before it was apparent to me. I had a forum in which I would just kind of answer questions and chat about anything. We would talk about TV and other people's music and politics and all kinds of stuff. And there was this community of people who, the more deeply invested they were in the forum, the more they would talk about what I was up to musically outside of it. It just made sense that I'd become a part of their lives, both the soundtrack to it and the kind of the conversation about music that they were having. So this, I had this space where that was happening. And when Twitter came along, it looked like a better version of the same thing. So I said, okay, I'm going to jump over to this space. I'm going to go and start using Twitter, and you lot can come with me if you want. I'm going to shut the forum down because this doesn't need to happen in a walled garden. It doesn't have to be branded as MySpace rather than MySpace. It doesn't have to be branded as Steve's Space. It can just be a conversation, and that's what happened. And all the regular users piled in over at Twitter, and they're all still there now, and we still talk to each other and to other people. Again, within that, once that conversation was broadened, my role within that became that of a kind of music conduit, that rather than it just being me sat there going, hey, everybody buy my shit, which is wholly uninteresting when someone walks in, it's like imagining someone walking into a pub and doing that. I became someone who was a fulcrum around which music listeners and music makers discovered each other. And also that the music makers discovered that they themselves were music listeners. They stopped defining themselves as just artists who kind of, trying to pound the world with marketing messages, but were actually part of that discovery process for their own audiences. And I've spent, the last 3 or 4 years modelling that to people who are smart enough to listen and watch. And I'm responsible for 10 times as many sales of other people's music as I am of my own, roughly. That I can generate a healthy handful of sales for most of the stuff that I get excited about, which means that the person who's put the record out has suddenly made a couple £100 because I was nice enough to talk about it, and it didn't take me long. So in terms of the economics of that, the reason for doing that is A, it's a good thing to do, but B, it's not difficult at all to see a near future in which that is the main way that we discover music, is through the people whose music we love telling us about the things that they love. That recommendation process, which isn't paid for, which isn't reciprocal. It's not me talking about someone else's music because they talked about mine. It's just me getting passionate about things I care about. That actually,
it's not your Spotify playlist.
no, it's not a spot. It's much more disseminated than that. And that because the problem with Spotify is that so you send someone into Spotify and where do they go from there? Well, they go to either Spotify or to Google and to look it up. And actually, that's quite a big leap. That all the surveys on people's internet use show that actually it takes quite a lot to trigger someone to be bothered to type someone's name into Google after they heard them on another service. And you have no control over the links on Spotify. I took my music off Spotify, not because I thought that I wasn't getting paid enough, but because I was annoyed that someone else was getting paid, that the major labels, as major shareholders in it, were getting paid money, and I'd rather they cease to exist than were funded off my back. But also that there were two other things. One was I had no control over the kind of advertising that was put next to my music, and I'm quite fastidious about that. I don't like the idea that my stuff is littered with adverts for products that I don't endorse, of which there are very few. And B, I had no control over the contextual links that were placed there over the bio. That they pull the bio in from a site that I'm not on. So, and I didn't, as far as I could tell, I couldn't get on. So it was like, well, hold on a minute. So they've got my music, they're making money out of it, but they're not giving me anything back in return. And I didn't even need money. I just wanted control over that stuff, and it wasn't there. So I pulled my music off it. And largely because Bandcamp, the service that I do use, just does it better. That you can go there and listen to things infinitely if that's what you want to do. You could, but then there's the option to download it at a higher resolution and have it hosted locally and get access to all the other stuff that's there and share it around. That you can, the links to that stuff. But they're all on my own space. I kind of own that space, and that feels more tangible and more significant because I can brand it. So alongside all of this sort of recording stuff, I've managed to keep doing the rest of the stuff as well. I stopped being a journalist a while back, but I still write, and the writing manifests itself now as part of a project called Amplified, which is a social media facilitation project that we as part of a conversation at an event called Tuttle. The Tuttle Club was a thing that started in London at the end of 2007, beginning of 2008, and it was a bunch of geeks who liked social media, the sort of emerging social media tools, getting together in a pub on a Friday morning and having a conversation about what that meant for art, politics, education, business, all that kind of stuff. And we would just meet up and drink coffee and talk about it. And out of that came a number of projects, one of which was Amplified. And so we identified that given all the changes that were happening in the world, that the economy was falling apart and lots and lots of things were shifting, all these events were going on where the sole output from them was the bloke on the platform talking or a journalist reporting on it. And that was never the interesting stuff. The interesting stuff was people talking over coffee, was the responses of the people in the room, was all the kind of the peripheral stuff that actually at best the keynote speech was an agitation that meant other people thought interesting things, and at worst it was just a waste of 40 minutes. So we came up with this system for documenting that. We came up with a way of shaping events around that other kind of output, making talks shorter, ending talks with a question, having teams of conversational facilitators there to kind of record people talking about what was interesting to them. And I still do that, and I still pretty much run that. There's three of us that are sort of on the steering team, but I'm the one who's doing the day-to-day running of it. And that became really key because it allowed me to solidify a few of the thoughts about how social media works for disseminating wider conversations. Obviously my primary interest is in how that works around art, but also around politics and activism, and the necessity of having a multiplicity of voices talking about any event. That the world of particularly NGOs and big arts organisations became incredibly became a bit of a sort of middle class monoculture, where you'd have these people talking from the platform who'd earned the right to be there over years and years and years, and were all said the same crap. They all came out with the same stuff, and all the people in the audiences were responding to it in different ways, and responding to it as people who were poor, as people who were struggling to keep their arts organisations together, as people who were protesters. We did some work with the NCVO, the National Council for Volunteer Organisations, And that's a very broad tent in that they cover everybody from the sort of almost illegal protesters who are blocking roads and digging up trees and stuff, through to volunteer organisations that look after providing help to Prince Charles for God knows what, all kinds of stupid stuff. And so the range of voices at their events were really, really interesting, and the platform was always an old white bloke talking. So that the way that ties in with what a widening of access to the tools of dissemination for art meant was that in both situations you suddenly end up with this brilliantly diverse culture, this fabulous multiplicity of voices and stories and messages and people who are all making kind of small-scale contributions to what's going on. But when you sum them together, it's really important. And we got hoodwinked for the latter half of the 20th century. We got sold this massive lie that the only thing that mattered was numerical success. If you had 10 million listeners, then what you were doing was important, and if you didn't, then it wasn't. And it's bullshit. And we got sold it as musicians. People got sold it in the media. People in organisations got sold it because they thought that what they needed was more supporters and more people turning up to their rallies. And we lost the ability to actually think with any integrity about what we were doing and do it because it was important, not because it was successful. And the internet allows us to reverse that and to start to find other small groups of people who are challenging the same issues. And we haven't really sorted out the culture of how that works at all. Everything's in flux. But in terms of making a living, it meant that as what was would broadly be thought of as a social technology consultant, I was able to work on lots and lots and lots of little projects for money that would keep me alive, rather than going, what, the important thing here is me making $5,000 a day advising the government on whatever. I wasn't interested in doing that. It's not that I wouldn't be interested in getting $5,000. It's that the kind of situations in which that happened were ones that tended to actually shut down the conversation eventually. Because they led the people in power to believe that that's what it cost to do these things, and as a result, instead of commissioning ongoing work, they just went, oh well, we've had our one-day consultation with this really smart bloke off the internet, and that's all we could afford. And then they go off and behave like idiots again. And I was much more interested in spending weeks at a time with organisations, completely changing the culture of how they use the internet, completely rethinking their policy on transparency, on opening up their sense of what their message or what their core message is to the influence of their users and constituents and stakeholders, and that all of that stems from the music. All of that stems from me trying to make music that is important to me, and allowing other people to be a part of that and to share that and to make it a part of their lives, without me saying, well, if you're not giving me 10 quid for a CD, then you can sod off, because I'm only in this for the money, because it's ridiculous. I wouldn't be playing solo bass if that was the case. It'd be the worst career move ever. What kind of idiot goes into being a solo bass player because they think they're going to make money at it? It's be so stupid. But likewise, who the hell goes into voluntary work in order to try and make money? Who goes into we've got an entire government made of people who are horrifically entitled scumbags who are taking rent payments on second houses when they're already worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds themselves, and then complaining about the fact that there's no cap on housing benefit. I mean, it's just the sense of entitlement is horrific and really obscene. And being part of a counterculture to that, even if it's not kind of marching down Whitehall with placards, being part of modelling a different way of doing things is really important. And the fact that I can do it and make enough to pay the bills most months is a good thing.
Question there, and going back to the politics thing as well. Why does an organisation like the RIAA or whatever the hell they're called?
Yeah.
Why do they have such disproportionate power within Washington and within policymakers? Why do you think they have this ability to come up with bills that could potentially shut down the internet or shut down parts of it or shut down people's access to it? Where do they get their power from?
Two or three things. One of which is the power of that myth, the late 20th century success myth of Hollywood and the record industry, that when the conversation was happening in Parliament about the Digital Economy Act, one of the main politicians who was influencing people's views was a Scottish MP who used to be in Runrig. And people were kind of in awe of the fact that this guy had been on top of the pops. He was the only serving MP who'd been on top of the pops. But he was on top of the pops in an awful band. You know, it's kind of like, nobody. I doubt anybody there could have named a single Runrig song, but they were kind of like, oh, he's been on top of the pops. That means he knows about this stuff. So it was that level of asinine thinking that's at work, and that's at work at the top level. So there are two or three things. One of which is that history is written by the winners, and so the account of what the record industry has meant to the world for the last 60 years has been written by the record industry, not by the millions of people who've been failed by it. So they come up with this completely twisted bunch of statistics that say, look, this is what we were making before, this is what we're making now, and this is why, and it's all because of the internet. And so they're serving up a bunch of lies. So I'll give you a very quick example. There's a lot of the talk is in terms of sort of the lost sales is that the sales of music media peaked in the late 90s and has been falling ever since. What they don't report on is there are two other statistics that feed into why that is. One of which is that physical entertainment media has kept going up since then. It's just that it's now distributed across games, DVD box sets, and music. So music has lost out to other entertainment forms that look like much better value for money. Because a CD you listen to, and it's an hour's music, and there's nothing progressive about that. I mean, we get committed, we get involved in music, but actually the number of records that that become part of our life soundtrack is relatively small. Whereas with a game, you've got a couple, upwards of a couple of weeks of full-time entertainment from a single game. And a DVD box set is 50 episodes of House for the same kind of money, for 15 or 20 quid if you shop around online. So why the hell wouldn't you do that? The other thing to note about that is that both games and DVD box sets are basically massive licensed compilation albums. They're chock full of licensed music that's been paid for to the industry, and they never talk about that. So the sale of physical entertainment media containing music is higher than it's ever been. The second thing is that peak in the late 90s was people replacing their vinyl and cassette collections on CD. That a massive amount of that, of the money in the old recording industry is about the value in archive, in legacy recordings. The fact that the Beatles managed to top the iTunes chart the year that their stuff appeared on iTunes I was utterly baffled by that. I was like, who the hell feels obliged to pay for Beatles stuff? Why would anyone do that? It seems insane. Why it's not in the public domain, I've no idea. It's like, what, Ringo's still recouping? No, I don't think so. But that's where the value is for them. It's in works that have paid themselves off years and years and years ago, and they're still managing to kind of wring the last few pence out of them. The contemporary work has never been where the big money was. So those are the main things. One, so it's the figures are all lies. The headline figures are massive. I mean, the fact they can go, look, we used to bring in X billion pounds to this country, and now we can't. What they never report on is that outside of the BPI's measurement, there's a whole secondary economy. That none of my sales, none of the money that I make off music ever goes through any of their accounting processes, because I don't report it. I don't sell my stuff on services that report to them. So there's potentially a massive recording industry outside of that. But the other thing that they always ignore is that the cost of making records is now less than a tenth of what it was for the equivalent quality 20 years ago. I mean, it is an order of magnitude smaller, the cost of making an album. There are still certain things that are done best in a studio, recording drums and vocals in particular, but there are ways around all of them, and there are people sat at home making incredible music for no money, and doing it because they understand that art making doesn't have to be speculative. Painters don't go out and say, right, I'm going to spend £1 million on brushes because that means that I can then make better paintings, and then complain because they can't make that £1 million back on their paintings. They go, no, I'm going to use whatever bloody brushes I can get my hands on. I'm going to go down to Poundland and buy myself some brushes because that's all I can afford. And I'm going to paint great pictures. And musicians tend not to do that. They tend to get hung up on this idea that they deserve 6 weeks in the studio at 12 grand a week. And you go, really? You're insane. Why would you do that? That's nuts. Why wouldn't you stay at home and make music, sell it, and then once you've made some money on it, go and invest that into making the second record? So there's this idea that there's this binary economy, that either we do it the record industry way and the world makes billions off it because Celine and Sting and Elton sell millions of records, or we go the other way and all of a sudden it's all gone to shit and no one's making good music anymore, and it's this hideous disinformation, and it's all a pack of lies. I'm surprised that so little of it has ever been challenged in court, but they do have an enormous amount of money for lobbying. I mean, they keep piling it in. I remember Tom Watson saying that he'd never seen more money spent on a lobby than around the Digital Economy Act. That the BPI and the PPL invested massive amounts of money in hassling MPs. I mean, there were leaked memos that they were sending around going, "Quick, we need to rush this through because they haven't spotted what's wrong with it yet." They're just lying bastards, basically. So the big problem legislatively is not their existence, it's the fact that they do start to influence laws that make it impossible to do what we do. They don't want a level playing field. The level playing field is kind of what we got now. But leveling the playing field actually stacks things in my favour because I'm willing to have a conversation with the people who listen to my music. That all of a sudden...
It's interesting you mentioned that, because I see that, since some of the stuff you've been using, some of the services you've been using, you're kind of trying to get away from or whatever because of the... I think it was when Instagram was sold or whatever to Facebook for $1 billion or whatever stupid silly money. You were on Twitter and you were saying, right, it's we've got to get onto platforms that we control.
I mean,
part of a strategy.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have an issue with the idea that the grand funding project for things is that people who make services for us do it for free, and in return we let them scrape our data and sell it to governments and advertisers. I have a massive, massive problem with that. I'm quite happy to pay for things. I like paying for services if they leave me the hell alone. And so someone like Facebook, where it's the biggest data scraping project the world has ever known. I mean, it's just enormous. What is it, 15% of the planet's population is on there now? I mean, that as a data generating thing is so huge, and it means that their design is based around generating data, not facilitating meaningful conversation. So what they want to do is they try and obfuscate certain things so that as you go looking for them, you see more adverts. They're not interested in meaningful conversation. What they want to do is they want to monetize the whole thing. And so particularly when the IPO came up a couple of weeks ago, if you're selling your company at 100 times its annual turnover, you need to start making some changes pretty damn quick to how you make money in order to ramp that up. That is not going to lead to business as usual. And when your business is selling advertising and selling data, both of which are massively intrusive on your audience, and you know that there's a fair bit of your audience that are already on a knife edge over whether or not that's an acceptable thing to do, you need to start hiding those practices. So it kind of stands to reason that Facebook is going to get more and more pernicious. And so when they bought Instagram, which was the first social network I'd come across in ages that I actually liked, I actually got quite annoyed. I was like, why? Why are they messing with us? Why do Facebook want ownership of my pictures? This is horrible. And yeah, there were things in their terms and conditions that would mitigate them actually being able to stick it in an advert. And I think if they did, they'd start hemorrhaging users. It's like when MySpace said that they had the rights to all of our music. And what they meant was, we don't want to get sued when someone else embeds a MySpace player on their website. But Facebook seems to have taken that further than pretty much anybody. So what I'm hoping for an emerging world where people start building services and charging for them, and that enough of us realise that paying... I mean, Twitter would be the perfect example. If Twitter turned around and said, you know what, here we are, here's a premium account, it's 60 quid a year, and we'll just leave you alone. You can turn off trending topics, you can turn off adverts. None of that rubbish is there anymore. We're not going to track anything you do, we're not going to target you with any crap at all. We're just going to let you get on with forming meaningful relationships around conversation. I'd be on it like a shot, and I know a bunch of other people who would. And I hope someone comes along with that kind of service and that it can actually build volume. Because now would be the perfect time for Twitter to do that. To actually say, okay, we've got all of this stuff ready to go, we're going to flood your timeline with adverts if you're not willing to pay for it, and then we can pay for it and it'll be fine. And especially if they made a way for us to be able to gift it to people kind of overseas who couldn't afford it. If they said, right, well, you can pay 60 quid for your own account, or you can pay 90 quid and we'll have your account, and we'll also give away 2 ad-free accounts to people who work in education in Latin America or something like that. That would be great. That's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see them suddenly not being evil and actually kind of showing that they have a bit of heart and they understand just how pernicious that level of data scraping and ad pushing is. Because I hate the idea that my music is viable because people see other crap around it and have to buy it in order to make it viable for me to make music. That's a horrible thought. I'd much rather people were in a position where they could pay for the music they like, not pay for the music they don't like, share it, be part of the kind of an economy or an ecosystem that wasn't just about, pay or not pay.